Some have asserted that the death of philosophy, so called, has been, in all extant works, ludicrously exaggerated. Others take a different view on the matter, and pointing those others, I would point more towards Husserl, phenomenology. Hume is also proto-phenomenology, according to Heidegger, or quote-unquote almost proto-phenomenology, and further in that direction. So then we have many forts and many colonels and lieutenant colonels of that position, and many generals and many supreme command, or let's say a half dozen supreme commanders, such as Dugin, in that direction. Then we have the people that. So the first is philosophy, then phenomenology and everything in that direction, and the third is the most core liberal position, which would be some kind of science as a fact-value distinction in some way, especially in the way laid out by Simmel. And made to take over the American universities by the popularizer of Max Weber, Talcott Parsons. Some form of the fact-value distinction, which then corresponds to the understanding of what ideology is, which would be somebody arguing for their values with facts. So a selective collection of facts according to a thesis. So this is the problem with the some have with the initial reading of the sorry, not a full reading, but I've read just the first 75 pages of this thesis, and now I'm reflecting on it, of the Costin Alamariu to do thesis on the concept of physis, or nature, as out of the selective breeding of the customary ways of life, according to some notions connected to the nomoi, or the customary ways of life, or the nomos, and the nomos physis dispute, of course, being central to the origins of Athenian philosophy, but in connection specifically with these ideas about pastoral society, which we can date exactly genetically according to the alleles that show us about lactose tolerance, and which, from the historical point of view, I think at Columbia we have a very good, maybe the best, on this subject from the point of view of a historian, is Richard Bullitt has done a lot of work on dating this kind of origin of the such things as lactose intolerance at the beginning of the raising of milk-giving animals, and so and other things of a like kind, of donkeys, of wagon technology, of other things. Richard Bullitt at Columbia, but the Alamariu, or so I just an aside, it's like at first I thought this was BAP was then Bronze Age pervert was then taking on a second pseudonym, but then now it looks pretty clear that this is elite university prolonged. So I mean, the way it works is people who don't want to teach but would rather do like more and more research, they find a way of being graduate students for as long as possible and never getting their degree. But apparently he's got the degree in 2015. Actually, it doesn't say that he was awarded the degree. Maybe it was refused, but I noticed that his dissertation advisor was somebody who's quite interesting. I've looked at his work in the past, Stephen Smith, who's done some kind of work on Machiavelli and Hobbes and Strauss, and who appreciates the tradition very well, I think. That being said, it looks like this Alamariu is the actual name. So therefore, we're not going from one sort of wild name to another pseudonym, but to somebody who's in the elite university system, activated by this third. So remember, we named the philosophy, which some say the question of its death is far from ludicrously exaggerated, simply observable. And instead we have this fact-value distinction in control, right? And then there's the people rebelling against it that go toward in the direction of Heidegger, and also Zizek in a weird sort of rump way, because Zizek acts like we're still at the time of Kant. Although if Hume is the proto-phenomenologist and Kant is primarily stimulated by Hume, along with Rousseau in the moral region, then in a way he's already in the phenomenology, and so to that extent Zizek is also already there as well, but not, I think, with such a consciousness of, or actually with the refusal of historical consciousness, let's say, whereas Dugin accepts it. And of course Heidegger has struggled with it in his struggle between eternity and the Hegelian claim that the absolute is the final relative age, that knowledge is relative to the absolute age, and the absolute age is identical to eternity, which is, according to Hegel, the age we're already living in. So if that's true, if there's the 1, 2, and 3 positions, then this thesis is argued from the third, which is basically we could call the close reading, doctrine of close reading, which one would not find in the medieval university, which is to say to amass as many passages and scholarly documentation this sort of so let me think of the images the in Nietzsche, where he's talking about, I think in chapter 38 of the Zarathustra, of on the scholars. Gelehrte, how is that in German? But sometimes it's mistranslated as intellectuals. But it would say intellectual is somebody who's read a lot and then likes to sort of dogmatically insist that they know things just because they read them in a book somewhere. That's kind of what intellectuals are like. But everybody in the Prussian sphere would have distinguished intellectuals from scholars who know their passages in classical texts and can show you questions about all sorts of proofs of arguments, like the kind that Alamariu is making here, where he's showing us both the etymological history of fusus to an extent. He doesn't actually give it like a Jesuit type of presentation, but he just points to certain moments, like the Odyssey as the first instance of the word, and he kind of sketches all the standard stuff, and then nowhere actually in those first 75 pages do I see anything that isn't just basically scholarship, in that sense of supposedly presenting a very strong forensic case by citing all kinds of text in a scholarly manner, and then under the claim that these texts build up inductively, so you build out of the text, they build up inductively to a thesis which becomes visible when the evidence is amassed, which is also a strategy for doing ideology, according to the version of ideology that goes with the fact-value distinction. This is the way of reading text, which is still considered the most rigorous. Nietzsche has already attacked that in this very chapter where he's saying, I'm walking above the heads of the scholars, and they insulate themselves more and more from me because they don't want to hear this. In this sense, the auctoritas, or the sort of, in the Bible, it's already said in the New Testament at least, is that Jesus spoke as one with auctoritas and not as the scholars, right? So this is the part of what Nietzsche is saying, that to go from being a scholar to being an Übermensch means to bring one's own auctoritas to the text. So this is one thing I see lacking in this text, but it's not an obvious criticism, because this is clearly, we're dealing with somebody who's trying to argue a thesis within a specific Tennessee Valley authority that says you have to build your dam this way, otherwise we won't accept it. And all dams have to be built this way, and we're going to send people to, according to Truman, we're going to send people to China to teach them to build dams this way. And this is the Platonic idea of how to build dams in the modern world, and so on. So there's a specific tightrope walker in a specific form. He's going very carefully, very slowly. He's reproducing the idea in a Platonic manner infinitely. He's saying we have these imponderable resource of the idea. It can be repeated. Anyone can learn it. It's already known. It's been invented. Anyone everywhere on the earth can learn to follow the advisors from the Tennessee Valley Authority that tell you how to build a dam. So likewise, we have a specific way of treating with texts, and this is the way he's following in this whole presentation. He's amassing evidence after evidence after evidence, and he's supposing that it will build up to proof of a thesis, but he's doing it in such a way as to suggest that it's not a question of a conclusion in search of arguments, but the thing is supposed to be presented as though there's an essential difference between that a conclusion in search of an argument, or top-down approach, and the inductive approach. He presents it as though, because a number of cases have shown up concretely in the text and in the tradition, then the agenda can of itself emerge, so that we can say we've only read out of the text, we haven't read into the text. So against this is that when we go in the phenomenological point of view, and also already in the Nietzschean Übermensch point of view, we admit that we're always bringing something of ourselves to the text, and usually in something of an overt way, because we have to say this is what the evidence that we have to give meaning, significance to the amassed congeries of stuffs that we've got there, right? So it's interesting. I'll just bookend it with this, is that since this guy, as a Bronze Age pervert, seems to have powerfully given a distinctive, what he called exhortation, which is kind of a word Strauss would often use, rather than arguing a case. So aware of all these, this whole, as it were, methodology that we're compelled to be in order to orient ourselves towards the situation where we take in some way seriously that the universities have a certain way of understanding things, distinct from how medieval university would have understood them, distinct from how the powers of the Confucians, who frowned on certain sexual excesses in the Tales of Genji in Japan, um, sometime after the year 1600 or so, and therefore practice a little bit reminding of Plato or Socrates criticizing Iliad and Odyssey and so on. We can see that Bap has exercised a certain authority in his first text that he doesn't exercise in this one, because it's controlled by the claims to the rigorous pattern of scholarship as it's meant to be understood just now. But again, even these three distinctions we bring out are conceptualized, and then they fall into this domain of the Übermensch, who says, oh, here's these different forms, which am I going to read the deepest emotion into? And this brings us to the point where phenomenology begins, and where the concept as the difference between, in Husserl, the natural and the theoretical attitude tries to handle this, but notice it conceptualizes both and then doesn't quite express what it wants to express. I think Husserl is aware of this, but nonetheless he says this is why one has to constantly keep going out on sorties and can never just say, why one has to be phenomenological rather than simply saying in a conceptualized theoretical way, this is the starting point. So I hope that indicates in some way, however vague, the direction of these considerations, which aren't just how should one say, clouds scudding along over the site of a duel somewhere, but they are indeed clouds scudding along over the site of various wars and so on, and there's a direct connection between the clouds and the various political struggles being wrought out by other means.